We are now being recorded. So welcome everyone. It is Groundhog Day, yes, and so you know all of this might be repeated if you go with the Bill Murray School of what is happening, that is. I want to welcome back those who attended last week and to those who took part in any of our 2021 webinars. Thanks for joining us today. Donations management is the theme for the discussion today, and before I introduce our two guests, I'll introduce myself. I am Peter Smith, your host, and I'm the Executive and Creative Director for the Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity, and it is an honor and a privilege to be here. Today, I am in the city of Toronto, and I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and further acknowledge that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We invite you to share that the land you live on and are participating from today in the chat section, if you like. We want to thank the recovery cohort and others who are supporting the creation of these sessions. They include the BC Association of Emergency Managers and BC Hydro. And I'd be remiss if I didn't offer a special shout out to Deb Borzos, a force within your community and within many other communities, who is also the producer of this series. And Alexa is our IT producer for today, and we really appreciate all that she does. Any resources or information or comments you have to share can be added to the chat section throughout today's session. There will be a list made and shared of links as well as presenters' contact information at the end of the series. Now, if you want to contact a presenter or find information shared from a particular session before then, please be in touch via the following link, communitydisasterrecovery@gmail.com, and Alexa will put that into the chat. And I'll also ask her to also put in the links for the British Columbia Association for Emergency Managers for reasons that will become clear in a second, and for the Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity. So thanks for that. The sessions are being recorded, as you heard, and will be kept on the BC Association of Emergency website. Usually takes a week or so to get them loaded to the site, so please be patient with us. During the presentation, please leave your video and audio turned off, as for some attending, it can offer challenges with instability of connection. We have an hour, so I'll get right to it. I'll introduce each guest and we'll turn things over to them one at a time. They each have approximately 20 minutes, and we will have a Q&A after the second presentation, time permitting. I'll keep an eye on the chat for your questions, observations, and reflections as the presenters offer their insights, and we'll get to as many of those as we are able following the two presentations. So first up, our first guest is Denyse Koo. And Denyse has a 30-plus year history of working with children and families in a variety of settings, including overseas, managing childcare centers and programs for military families, and working in the emergency department of the hospital. Being a constant learner, she is a canoeing and archery instructor, has 2 degrees, and is retired certified professional of human resources, currently working in a veterinarian hospital. She has failed at retirement 4 times. One of those failed retirements was due to the BC wildfires. In 2017, Denyse was asked to create a donation management program for the province because of her extensive paid and volunteer work with not-for-profit and charity organizations. As this was a new position, there was no operational manual. So Denyse, being Denyse, created an approach based on environmental responsibility, pragmatism, community relationships, and customer service. This was an award-winning model that she will share with us today, along with other key lessons learned from her 2.5 years with Emergency Management BC and years of community involvement. Denyse, a pleasure to have you here, and I'm now going to turn things over to you.
Hey, thank you, and welcome everybody. Thank you, Deb, for thinking of me. As Peter said, I started because of Emergency Management BC contacting me. And when I started, there was no operational manual. I was basically shown a computer and said, go. So what I did is I looked at what was done historically. I looked at the list of the 17 corporate donors who had already contacted EMBC and tried to think of how can I manage this the best. The key direction that I was given is don't take anything. Don't take anything in to store or to keep. So that's what I started from. So based on what I've done in the community and based on that key experience with EMBC, what I'd like to do today is to talk to you about the provincial approach that I developed and that we used for 2017 and 2018. talk about key learnings of things that can be done in your communities, how to help donors to donate what is actually needed, and what to look for in a donation manager. So to start with, in 2017 and 2018, I looked at and considered what happened in other disasters and the complexities of taking in donations. I'm sure that you will all be aware of this, and this is probably why you're attending this today. I was actually told by the executive director that nobody wants to touch donation management, usually with a 10-foot pole. So I considered the complexities such as receiving, sorting, garbage, storage, security, and distribution. Other disasters, I learned, have dealt with massive amounts of garbage and have taken years sometimes to get rid of unwanted items that were donated. That also includes and then results in excessive use of manpower and excessive cost. So what I developed was what we end up calling the matchmaker approach. When someone had something they wanted to offer, what I did is, rather than taking in the goods, I kept a really detailed Excel spreadsheet. Went back to the old-fashioned way of using Excel. A key item that I checked on with each donor was, did they have the ability to transport their donations? So what I ended up doing is working with some companies that could do that, but also working with companies who transported either their own products or products for other people. What they were able to do is sometimes to add donations into their regular shipment, like just at the back of their transport truck. And because it was either already to community that they serviced, or they were going through or near those communities, they then were able to drop off donations on our behalf. So some of these were large grocery chains, pharmaceutical companies, you'll all laugh at this one, beer companies, they were awesome, and other supply companies. No, we did not accept beer. Okay. Also, I built relationships with key established not-for-profit organizations that exist or service impacted areas, because I realized that some people are from smaller communities. They don't actually have these offices in their communities, but sometimes they'll have one in a bigger community nearby that sends out staff members. So I worked with them to take in and distribute donations, or to help me to identify key community organizers who could find out what the needs were in the community, and they could distribute the items as well through their organization. I was in touch with these people constantly to find out what was needed and what they were hearing in the community. Also, through the Emergency Management BC pre-auks, if items were offered, I would also get the message out to them and say, hey, we got 100,000 batteries. Who needs batteries? So rather than just having a donation go to one community, I acted as a hub so that we could then distribute where it was needed. So splitting large donations. So that could be things like batteries, it could be food or other things. And I'll mention food a little bit later. A key thing is just not to keep things in storage, but to share it. So asking, for example, we had one company, a food company, that donated a large amount. None of the food banks could actually use that amount of food. So we distributed it between 3 different food banks. I managed that by being in touch with the main coordinator of BC food banks, with that manager. She reached out to all the food banks, found out which ones needed food, and then we split that donation into 3. On that note, one thing is to also not just consider the community that's impacted by the disaster. What we found is that if a community had to evacuate, the evacuees sometimes went to the next largest community near them, and that community got impacted because they were trying to support them. One of the communities, the food bank, said that in 2017, in 3 months, they distributed a year's worth of food hampers. So because they had the evacuees coming, and then they had the evacuees sometimes going to their family members, the family members couldn't afford to feed them because it was unexpected, and then it became extended. And so the food banks went through way more food than they usually did, so 4 times the amount. So with talking about how we found out what was needed, with transporting things, not storing things, we basically never physically accepted any donations, but directed things where they were needed. So some other things I'd like you to think about in dealing with donations is to think about short-term, medium, and long-term. Short-term, what they need right now because they've just been evacuated. I'd like you to remember that emergency support services does provide help for the first 72 hours. Of course, in each community, it depends on how big your ESS team is. Some of them are smaller, some of them have less funding and less volunteers. So they sometimes may need more help or are able to support just to a minimal level rather than being quite elaborate in what they provide. Consider if they've been impacted as well, because if it is a whole community, sometimes the ESS team, even though they're well established and well practiced, they may not have the people being able to show up to act in their role as ESS. After the usual first 72 hours of ESS, the Red Cross usually steps in. What I learned, though, is that the Red Cross, unless it's a provincial emergency, they act by the agreements that they have in place, and they actually don't have agreements with every single community. So it's a good thing if your community thinks in advance and make sure that you have those agreements in place. From a really practical perspective, we also want to think about the number of people who will seek help from these services, from ESS or from Red Cross. We're a really mobile society nowadays, so people are moving across countries or from country to country, and they don't have the same support systems like they would have if they were in their hometown. Sometimes people think, oh, just ask your parents or ask a family member who's nearby. Some people don't have that. So a lot of times there's more people who need help than we realize. I've also heard a comment about donations. So when they sometimes get those first donations from ESS to support them in their initial evacuation, well, we already provided a hygiene kit. I don't know how many of you have traveled and bought those little travel toothpastes or travel soaps or been in a hotel for an extended period of time. Please remember those don't last forever. So if somebody's going to be evacuated for, say, a month, that stuff's going to run out and they'll need more again. People do get vouchers and things through the ESS program, but if you think about the things that they will need over an extended period of time, I would rather see us be able to provide the easily accessible donations such as hygiene kits, if we can, so they can then use those ESS vouchers for bigger key items that they might need. So to move into that, now start thinking medium and long term. Depending on when a disaster happens and the extent of the disaster, somebody may not be able to rebuild for a long time. What we saw for some places, and I'm sorry, I'm in Sooke, so we can build all year round, but some of the areas that were impacted, winter hit and they cannot continue building. Also, some of the companies were impacted that do rebuilding, and so they could not either get supplies or get the manpower to do rebuilding. So people were impacted for a lot longer than we expected. I know that up in Fort Mac, I have a friend who is a builder up there, and he says that from when their fire happened, he still is not finished with all of his contracts rebuilding homes and businesses. So it can be an extended time. Now, one of the key things that I became aware of in coming up to the fall of 2017 was that with the extended time for recovery from a disaster, we had to think of things such as the changing seasons, as I mentioned, but also the events that happen in those seasons. A key audience that almost got missed was the children who are not in their homes, sometimes not in their hometown or city, and they were returning to a school that they didn't know and had no supplies. So think about the key things that come up within the next year. So do some long-term planning of what donations might be needed in the future. Okay. So that also included winter clothing. Everybody evacuated in shorts, or even some people in pajamas and sandals. And so coming into the winter time, we needed to arrange things such as winter clothing. So the other thing I'd like to think about is helping donors to donate appropriately. So sometimes people are just thinking the season in which the disaster happens. And sometimes we need to help them to keep that enthusiasm for wanting to help people, but have them think longer term into the next season or further down the road. So for example, when people are evacuated, if they go to a hotel or if they go into one of the reception centers, they don't need a couch. They will need a couch in the future, but once their house is rebuilt. One of the challenges that I found was to keep people's enthusiasm up for donating and to get through those changes in seasons or to get through the longer timelines. The other thing that you need to consider that can impact donors is if another disaster happens. So what happened when I was working doing donation management for the province is that we had a tremendous outpouring from companies and from individuals, small organizations like church groups. But as soon as one of the hurricanes happened in the States, they dropped us. They moved to the next set of people who needed help now. And they even actually came to us and said, hey, through your donations, do you have anything that you can pass on to this hurricane relief? Okay, so staying on top of donation and kind of getting agreements with people that they will provide things in advance for the changes and for the longer timeline is really important, because if another disaster happens, you may lose those potential donors. Now, looking to local community, that was the next thing I said I want to talk about. One thing I'd like people to consider is supporting the local businesses. In one community, we had significant large national grocery store support. They kept giving things like to the Salvation Army food trucks that went to feed volunteers and to feed evacuees. But when it came to putting together Christmas hampers for the evacuated community members, what we chose to do is use the local grocery store, local pharmacy, and local hardware store to put together gift baskets. What that did is it generated income for those local businesses and helped to ensure that they would still be alive when the community came back. If you think about it, it would be really horrible if your community came back and there were no commodities there. There were no services because they all shut down. Okay, so don't only think of those businesses though for what they usually provide. Think outside the box. Where I live, it's a small community. We've now grown from 7,000 to 13,000. And one of the businesses that I access quite often is the local fishing tackle business. Now, if you think about it, most people, when they evacuate, they don't need fishing tackle, okay? But what I do is I don't ask them for tackle. I ask them to support our efforts. So if it's, can you pay for a lunch for the volunteers? Can you buy a certificate from a different business that can go into one of our raffle baskets? That's how that business helps us outside of their usual business that they provide for the community. Okay. Now, with individual owners, I want to go through some of the things that we cannot, or that I recommend you don't take. So as a government donation management, when I created our guidelines, some of the things that I identified that we could not take included, of course, things like alcohol and tobacco and any drug-related donations. But also think of other limitations, safety and liability. So our guidelines included things such as not accepting things that had batteries in them. So even flashlights, people can use flashlights, people can use emergency radios, for example, but we never took them with batteries in them. So if you're looking at used items, you want to make sure you take those batteries out, or if you're getting new items, you get the new item and then separately provide batteries. That's because if you're shipping things with batteries in them or storing them with batteries in them, they can be a fire hazard. And then with that comes the liability, of course. The next part is helping donors to donate appropriately. One of the things I used to do is refer people to the Canada Helps website. I suggested to people that they go on there, find an organization that's already established, because as a government or government entity, you cannot accept cash donations, but they could donate to one of the local charities that then provides service to the community with the money that they get. You can also arrange through things like banks, large businesses, philanthropic people in the community to do matching donations. So any cash donations that people give actually sometimes gets doubled. The other thing is to do events such as local garage sales, so people can sell those things like those couches from their attic or garage, and then they can donate the money. So the key thing that I wanted to provide for you today is to know that you can do donations management, which without actually bringing things in. There's things to consider, such as helping local companies, and also to make sure that you help the donors to donate things that are actually needed by being really direct with them. Sometimes you may have to, and we've done that here, we've set up where we have people monitoring what people put into donation bins, and set up donation bins only for these 4 items that we're accepting today. Anything else that they want to donate, I'm sorry, you'll have to take it back home, and you can bring it to us again if we need those items and we identify that. And then some of my thoughts I want to share as a last closing is the things that you want to look for in a donation manager. It's nice if you can find somebody who's local, who really understands the community, as well as understanding donation management. Someone who knows not-for-profit, because those are a lot of the organizations you will deal with to help you with the donation management and with distribution to the community. And then also just somebody who is really good at communicating, who can be firm to say no to those donations you don't want, but can also be encouraging to people so that they don't feel put off if you don't take their donation items in the moment. So they can encourage them, they can support them, they keep those potential donors engaged, but they don't take things that you don't want in the moment. So I hope that all of that is helpful to you. It only very lightly touches the surface of donation management, because I could probably speak to you on this for like 2 days. So thank you.
Thank you, Denyse. That was awesome, and there's lots of food for thought in there. And I just need to draw attention, because I don't think everybody can read your T-shirt. It says, "I'm only talking to my dog today," but I think we're all very glad that you included us in your talk today, because that was absolutely terrific. Look forward to the comments and questions following our next guest's presentation. So I would now like to introduce to you Leila Dariwsh. And Leila is an emergency management and disaster resilience professional with a deep commitment to supporting impacted communities through innovative, effective, and equitable disaster response and recovery. Now, as a recovery operations specialist with the Community Recovery Branch of Emergency Management BC, Leila advises and supports communities in their recovery efforts from the 2021 Atmospheric Rivers event. Prior to her time with EMBC, Leila worked for the City of New Orleans Office of Emergency Preparedness, gaining valuable experience in volunteer and donations management, emergency operations and logistics, risk communications, community engagement, mass care, and recovery. Through the COVID-19 pandemic and multiple hurricanes, she coordinated a diverse coalition of over 50 local and national nonprofit and community organizations engaged in disaster response and recovery efforts. And as the lead for donations management for the City of New Orleans, she coordinated major PPE and food donation and distribution efforts during the COVID-19 pandemic. She also managed the Hurricane Laura Family Resource and Donation Center, providing donations and services for over 12,000 evacuees sheltering in New Orleans. Through multiple emergency activations and disasters, she served as the liaison for donors and philanthropic organizations. She is the recipient of an award for distinguished service from the City of New Orleans for her work. Leila has also worked as a disaster risk and resilience consultant for a United Nations Development Program project in the Caribbean, a seasonal researcher with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and served as the community outreach and government lead for the 2021 Hurricane Ida response with World Central Kitchen in Louisiana. Prior to her career in emergency management, she worked in the nonprofit and environmental sector in British Columbia and Alberta for over 13 years. She has a master's degree in disaster resilience leadership science from Tulane University, and it is great to have her here today to offer us her insights on donations management. Leila, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation. And I just wanted to thank Denyse for everything that she just said, because it was right on in terms of, I agree 100%. So let me just get the screen up. Are we good? You can see that? Okay, wonderful. So it's good to be here with you all today. I'm going to be talking about donations management as well. There's going to be a few things that I repeat from what Denyse said, so that just hopefully means it gets in a bit farther. And just to be clear, I'm going to be speaking from my experience south of the border, from my American experience, because I do not handle donations at EMBC. So I'll be speaking more from what I did in the States on that. And I'm happy to answer any questions after. So just to kind of frame the conversation, I'm going to be talking about a few different things here in terms of cash versus goods, having a donations plan, being proactive with messaging, engaging community partners, engaging philanthropy and the private sector. What do we do with unsolicited donations? And then also this idea of decentralized donations management and mutual aid networks. As Peter said in my bio, a lot of my experience with donations management comes from working for the City of New Orleans, and specifically through COVID-19 and multiple hurricanes, where I had to be a donations manager and I had to kind of handle, you know, that idea of we don't always want to be dealing with goods, but sometimes we don't have a choice because that's kind of what we're given. And then what do you do in some of those situations? It does function differently in the States in terms of some of the governmental plans and kind of procedures. And it's interesting, depending on what state you're in, there's a bit more plans and kind of things set up with donations. Florida as a state has a really strong donations plan, has kind of MOUs and kind of pre-positioned or kind of planned locations for warehousing. Louisiana maybe has that in principle, but doesn't necessarily follow it. And so I was working for the city at the time, and even though there was some state plans and contracts with NGOs to take over donations management, it took, you know, several weeks to a month to actually get that triggered. So we as the City of New Orleans had to kind of pick it up and run with it in that absence. So it's kind of interesting to see different ways things are handled. In some EOCs, like I think for Florida, they have folks like Uber and Amazon in their business EOC to kind of directly kind of coordinate on donations and things like that. It's just a different way of looking at things. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of outline and share that a little bit in terms of a bit of a different approach. And then kind of going forward from there. At first, and I think Denyse mentioned this, anybody who ever gets tasked with donations is always told by, if you're a government, that this is not something they want to be doing. And it's this idea of donations being the secondary disaster, that people dump donations, you got to deal with all the sorting and the garbage of it. And there's this thing that happens because of it, where sometimes between, you know, state and local or provincial and local, or there's this like hot potato of let's try not to handle this and maybe someone else will take it on, or maybe we can give that to a different level of government or to the nonprofits. And, you know, there's good reason for that. But in my mind, when you do the donations hot potato, everybody loses, because there's a timing of donations and a timing of people's focus and generosity that you have to move quick, and you have to channel that and get ahead of it. And if you do channel it, get ahead of it, and have a little bit of like certain things set up, or you're able to think quick, you can actually do a lot of good in terms of abundance and generosity and meeting people's needs. But if you miss that moment because you're too busy trying not to do the thing or get somebody else to do it, that's a really important moment. And because we do live in an era of climate change and climate chaos, you know, you don't have the whole year to yourself to reach back out to donors, because as Denyse mentioned, they've moved on to the next disaster, which could happen weeks after yours or months after yours. And so you do have to kind of move quick. You do have to grab that. And it's not just the companies that move on, it's also people. They move on to giving to the next thing, or they become affected by the next thing. So again, just really trying to say, better to grab the potato than to try to pass it down the line, because in the end, you miss out on an incredible opportunity. And this is this constant, and you'll hear anybody who ever has done donations management just push this and push this hard, as well as try to push this publicly, is that the best way to give, and I think most of us know this, is cash donations in a disaster, and to give those cash donations to trusted organizations, preferably local organizations who are working with the most impacted, most vulnerable individuals in the community, or organizations who are coming in and who are disaster response and recovery organizations that are on the ground. I think we also see in disaster, and I'll speak from the American experience, is that some organizations will fundraise for a disaster that they're not actually at, and take really good funds away from the groups who are doing the work. And when you're in a local government role or a provincial government role, you do have the ability to sometimes highlight the people who are on the ground who are doing that work to help move donations into their organizations. And it's not just nonprofits and community groups and service organizations and service providers, it's also local foundations who might be having an eye to midterm and long-term recovery and creating funding that will keep that recovery moving past the point of the excitement where everyone's kind of donating at once. So being able to really direct people that way quick and fast and to keep that going is really good. Cash is efficient. It also gives, if you're doing it in a way where it's showing up as gift cards and things like that, that organizations are distributing, it also gives, disaster impacted residents and survivors autonomy to choose what they want. Instead of like what you're giving them, they actually have autonomy to make their own choices. So cash is always the way to go. But then in saying that, there is always going to be people who want to donate goods, because not everybody is flush with cash. And that beautiful spirit of giving is important. And there are ways to actually work really well with people's generosity when it comes to things. So we have the first thing is cash, but you will have to deal with goods regardless of whether you want to or not. Proactive messaging in any disaster, if you can have that information, if you have notice, and again, the disasters that I was working on, a lot of them were hurricanes, so you can see it coming your way, you got a few days. What we would do in the city of New Orleans is we would actually reach out to all our NGOs, and that was my job, and say, who's going to stand up for this disaster if it hits us? Who's going to do what? Can we put you up on our website? And we would get a website ready to go for literally the moment the disaster hit, that information was online and out to the media about who people could give to and where, and just kind of preempting that so we didn't have kind of chaos in the aftermath. If you have the capability to do that, kind of get ready for it, that's a good way to go. If it takes you a day or two after, that's also fine. But really working with local community groups and NGOs to know who can take what or who is going to actually engage and activate. There are also, like, even if you as a local government don't have a warehouse, don't have capacity to operate a donation center, there are folks in the community who may already, food banks or folks like that, or a church who want to take things in or are willing to stand that up, and trying to figure that out as quick as you can, or even as an interim before you get something bigger set up, is a really good way to start directing people. So you don't have folks just donations dumping at your shelter or your reception center or something like that. Again, that proactive messaging of consistently saying over and over again that cash to certain organizations is the best way to go, and making sure people understand why is important. Being clear what is needed and for how long is important. So you always have to be careful when you're doing media around donations, because you might say, hey, we need socks, and then you get inundated by socks, right? It's like, be careful what you're asking for. If there's something that you need a lot of, you say it out loud. Otherwise, you go and you privately ask donors and companies for those things, so you can control the amounts that you're getting. And then again, there's this temporal nature. You don't necessarily need winter coats in the summer. You have to be very careful about what is needed and when. And then that piece around being clear about what will not be accepted and sticking to that, because almost always some people want to give you what you're asking for, and then some people decide that this is the day they're cleaning out all their junk and they want to give it to you. And there's a lot of ways to block that, in terms of some people have, they pull up to the area where they would drop donations and there's someone there who's looking at their stuff and turning it away. Some people make it so they have to call and tell them what you're bringing, or just, ruthlessly say, we're not taking clothes. And no matter what, we're not doing it, right? And so I think it's really clear to put that messaging out. Also, if you put that out in the media and ahead of time, when people show up to try to drop off stuff they shouldn't, it's an easier conversation because they already know that they're doing something they shouldn't be doing instead of you surprising them at the door, right? And if you have to turn people away, have alternatives if possible. So maybe direct them to a thrift store, direct them to, if there's another community group that is taking things, say to them, hold on to this for a few months, like just try to find a way to deflect. I had to do a lot of that when we did a donation center for Hurricane Laura. And that was where a hurricane hit a community about 4 hours to the west of New Orleans. And then the state ended up sending 12,000 evacuees to the city of New Orleans without a lot of notice to us. And it happened around the same weekend as the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. So pretty much everybody in the city of New Orleans wanted to give and was fueled by so much love and also kind of trauma and kind of, not having had certain supports before. So it was like having to turn away a lot of people who were trying to give, but they weren't going through the proper channels or what we had asked. And I would also say as a local government, you want to, again, try to divert people to nonprofits to give first, whether it's goods or cash, before you have them coming directly to your site, unless you've set up some kind of system for that. So anyway, the proactive messaging, very important. This is just an example where our website for the city of New Orleans, we would have this pretty much like the moment the disaster was hitting or the night before, or like, hours after, we would have something like this go up, which would say, this is where you put donations. I can't show you on the screen, but below was like, these are the groups that are standing up to support. We just tried to get that information out as early as possible to kind of direct people the proper way. This is kind of like just a little review. I mean, there's a lot of different items that people want to donate. Again, we're always trying to push for the financial piece first. But there's also things like vouchers for services or hygiene kits. Mobility devices became a huge thing for us with our donation center, especially when you have evacuees. Baby items. I've never had to deal with so many diapers and formula types in my life. I'm not a mother, so it was difficult. Everything from pet food to books to cleanup kits. And one of the things that we really kind of worked with was, again, our different nonprofit partners, our different kind of companies. Like I did a lot of calling to companies and said, can you give us these things? Like we need like really specific items. Or if companies were calling us saying we want to give, really getting on that phone quick and directing them in terms of what we needed was very important. And then clothing, I put it in red because most people who know donations shudder when we talk about receiving clothing. But at the same time, it is needed sometimes. And we were really lucky, like we had a policy that we did not take clothing, but there was a nonprofit that actually was willing to solicit donations for clothing, sort everything for us, and then bring us the good stuff. And if you have that fortune, and it can be a nonprofit, it can be a faith group, it can be, there's lots of different groups who will take that on. And then it's a great thing to have clothing and have people kind of, have that option for folks, because a lot of evacuees leave with the clothes on their back and don't necessarily get to go back home, right? So that was an option. We also had these incredible thrift stores that kind of showed up and said, we're going to give you vouchers. If people come and they can't find what they need here, they can come get clothing from us, right? And I think there's, again, other ways to do it. We also worked with thrift stores to just come and give us the stuff they'd already sorted that they had extras of. So I think there's different ways, but you never really want to ask for clothing in the public. That is you will hate your life if you do. But again, sometimes it happens. And if you can channel it to different ways and have someone who can handle sorting and disposal, it can be a fun thing to have. Kid supplies, books, things like that. Again, really cool. Lots of folks can find ways to like package it and make kits for folks. We worked with libraries and the schools to do that as well, which is a really neat way to play. Furniture and appliances, that is something, and as Denyse mentioned, people don't need that in the first, few weeks or months, right? If they can't go back home, that's not helping them. But there might come a time where you actually do need to have that kind of stored somewhere at some point, and then we get into warehousing. Or you have companies, again, in the first week or the first 2 weeks, they start making offers and saying, we want to donate appliances and furniture to your flood impacted or fire impacted residents. And if you say, oh, great, we'll call you back in 3 months, you're not getting those. It's incredibly rare that something else hasn't happened or they haven't moved on from that point and they kept everything for you. So in a moment like that, you either have to find a way to warehouse or you have to find a way to lock that offer down where there's a voucher, there's like some kind of piece of like it's a gift card or whatnot, where people can actually capitalize on that later on in the game. Because if you don't grab it now, it's going to be harder to get later. One thing in donation centers, if people are coming and you have people kind of showing up and kind of getting donations like your evacuees and stuff like that, if you have a public facing center, is bags. This is something I didn't know. I was so busy trying to stock up on all the essential items that we had people coming and they had nowhere to hold it. And we had this really amazing nonprofit group that noticed that and kind of brought like reusable bags and things for people to put their things in, and food. So again, just a lot of different ways to think about stuff. One thing I want to say, vouchers for services, it's like as a donations manager, you can be talking and working on getting physical items for people. You can also be getting gift certificates and things like, transit passes, or we worked really closely with Uber to get kind of free Uber rides for folks so they could go to their appointments and things like that if they didn't have a car. And those are things that we had at our donation center, or working with Airbnb on certain pieces like that as well. So, you can be creative on that. It doesn't have to be a physical item. So there's this idea of both physical items and important services that can be gifted to people. A donations plan, I want to talk about this quickly. If you're a nonprofit or you're a local government, I think this is something that local and provincial governments need to think about, is kind of, do you have a plan? And, state of Louisiana had a plan, state of Florida had a plan. Doesn't mean people follow the plan, but it's nice to have a plan. It's nice to think through what you would do and who your people are, and to sometimes workshop that with people. And so some of the things to think about is, what are the community partners, the NGOs, the service providers, the businesses that you can work with? Especially if you're going to get a certain kind of disaster. Like if it's flooding, there's certain donations you need. If it's fire, it might be a different kind of thing. And kind of doing that work. And in terms of companies and large donors and specific requests, you can pre-think that and start to build relationships if you know what kind of hazard you're dealing with, so that it's easier to make that call when the time comes. In your community, are there large spaces that could hold donations? In the first couple of months of my job before hurricane season, I was meeting with churches and saying, if we had a disaster, could we use your church to be a donations warehouse or a donations distribution center? Having those conversations early, or looking at like, what are your rec centers? What are your kind of spaces as a city that could be used? And having a bit of that before the disaster, or having that in a plan, is a good way to go. This idea of a donations collection center versus distribution center, you might have both. You might have one that's the same. And a collection center is where all these donations are coming to, they're being warehoused, but the public isn't coming to. And then when nonprofits and governments are making requests, then that's coming out to where they are. And distribution center is more of a public facing place where people are coming to get those donations. For the Hurricane Laura, we used the convention center and had the public facing part in the front, and then the donations warehousing in the back. Sometimes that's all you have. You have that kind of more centralized spot, but thinking through what makes sense and how are you going to track donations to actually, know what's going in, what's going out, how much do you have of what. I already mentioned this, but having a communication strategy around donations and your messaging and being really tight and getting community partners to echo that. Like the biggest thing for us was we talked to our faith groups during some of these hurricanes and COVID to tell their congregations, or have other organizations tell their people what we wanted, what we didn't want, right? And push that out through the community. So it wasn't just coming out through the media. Volunteer coordination and having access to volunteers are huge. That's a huge place where working with NGOs is helpful. Or if you're a locality that has your own kind of volunteer program, you're going to need a lot of volunteers when it comes to donation sorting and kind of operating that side of things. And then finally, do you have a demobilization and exit strategy for wrapping up your donation center? What are you going to do with the excess donations? What are you going to do with the waste? Sometimes you're lucky enough where you can pay it forward because another community needs it. Other times it becomes an issue of, is there local organizations and service providers? How much of this is landfill? And those are all issues to think about. I mentioned this, the importance of engaging NGO and community partners. I cannot underscore this enough. And again, there are situations where governments have MOUs where an NGO takes this on behalf of the government. It handles the sorting and all that piece. And then there's others where you as a local government are working with your NGO partners to get you donations or to tell you what's needed and to also help get that out into the community. And we had a lot of that going on in terms of working with Food Bank and Junior League and SPCA. And, there was a mothers and babies organization that was bringing us lots of neat things for children. There's a lot of different ways to kind of work with it. And also looking at, can NGOs support with volunteers? Can they support with space? Are they able, again, to take money, and then you as a government need to really publicize the work they're doing to make sure that they are getting the funding they need to keep going through the recovery process. So just a few things to consider there. Philanthropy and donors. This is something where I mentioned this before, but my experience has been that offers don't wait. If a celebrity, and we got a lot of celebrities wanting to donate to us in New Orleans just because of the nature of the city, but if a celebrity or a big company or a philanthropy organization calls you saying, hey, we want to donate, you don't take a week to answer that call because you don't have anywhere to put it. You answer that call the next day, that same day, and you hook them. You kind of get them excited about, the opportunity, what your people need. You thank them profusely. You find a way to lock down that offer, even if you can't use it right now. And I think Denyse kind of mentioned this ability of getting it out. If you can't use it, who can? Are you connecting them directly with a nonprofit? How are you utilizing that? Because if they feel like they reached out and their offer was accepted and they feel good about it, it means 2 months from now, you can call them back in a different part of your recovery phase and say, hey, how are you? Can I ask you for something else? If you don't lock down that offer, if you don't return that call when it's hot, it becomes a lot harder to ask later on. So it's really key to grab that when you can and find a use for it, or find a way to deflect it, or even say to that person, I don't need this, but hey, we need this other thing. Tell the human story, hook them with the heart, and kind of try to get what you need from that. We had a point in COVID where we had so many people wanting to give us PPE at one point, but we needed rent money. People were getting turned out of their houses because they couldn't work because the economy was shut down. And so we had to say to some of these celebrities, we need you to actually put money into the rental fund. And it was sometimes an awkward ask, but we got them to pivot. And so I think you got to be strategic, but know how to make a pitch. As I already mentioned, the biggest flow of donations will come in the response phase and the early recovery phase. And it might not be what you need or what people need coming down the line. So again, anticipate your needs for recovery and find a way to either lock down those resources and commitment, or channel financial into foundations and organizations that will be there for the long haul. Because people are going to need things, and they're going to need, like, if they can't get a couch in the first week, they're going to need money for that later, right? So figure out a way to do that. And there's some really good local foundations and organizations that do come up with funds that are going to be utilized throughout the recovery process. One of the things that I learned in the States, and there was a really amazing mutual aid group that said to me, your audacity is your capacity. And I've always held that to heart. You make big asks at those initial days and weeks because people are feeling it. So you make those big asks and you back that up when you're dealing with philanthropy and with companies with big recognition and appreciation, because if they feel loved and appreciated, again, you can call them back either during your recovery or when the next disaster hits you. And that's a really important thing. And donors I worked with in COVID were the first people I called when we got hit by a hurricane. Like, it's just how it works. So it's important to kind of keep that going and to build those strong relationships with the private sector, with philanthropy, and with kind of, different donors. Unsolicited donations, I'll just say, and I'm not sure I'm at with time, so I'm almost done, but everybody gets these. Unfortunately, if you have any kind of physical site that someone can find, and it doesn't have to be a donations warehouse, it could be your shelter, it could be a reception area, someone will find a way to drop off something. So, the thing with unsolicited donations is, again, you message out that you're not going to accept it. You try to channel it to other places if you can. You be really clear about what you're taking and what you're not. You get cool with turning people away because you have to. And I always say you have to be ruthless with it, but you also can be flexible. So I know when I was doing the donation center with Hurricane Laura, I got really ruthless because people were trying to drop off used clothing and underwear. And I had a few days where I chased after people because it'd been a long year. But what I also had was days where churches came and schools came or people came where they said, I have all these things. And I said, we don't want that. We already said we're not taking it. And then they'd open the back of their car and they'd have beautiful hygiene kits that, folks spent hours packing in a gym or in a church that were perfect. And so I had to be like, okay, you know what, we are going to take that. But then I'd have to talk to them and be like, next time, ask me, and you create that relationship, because sometimes people will give you something you hadn't thought of, and that's amazing. But you do have to be ruthless about the stuff that you do not want, because if you do take it, it becomes your problem, right? So something to consider. And again, it happens to everybody, and it is a consistent issue. I did want to give a shout out to mutual aid networks quickly, just in the sense that there's a way where we talk about donations where a government's doing it or a nonprofit is doing it. And then there's some really neat movement where we're seeing folks on social media and different groups that are taking an approach of kind of neighbors supporting neighbors and providing kind of a kind of ability for residents and folks who are evacuees to post on social media on these Facebook groups or on these different kind of online platforms and saying, this is what I need. It's very specific. I have this need. And neighbors, instead of giving you what they think you should want, they actually say, well, I'll help you get that. I'll pick that up for you. I have that for you. I'll buy that for you. And that's something that we saw a lot in New Orleans. And one group in particular that did that was a group called Mutual Aid, Imagine Waterworks. And they did incredible work with that, where if we hand out flyers at our centers, they flyered at different shelters. And then people actually got online and got connected with folks who just got them what they wanted and built really beautiful relationships. So I do want to say that that's something that I know we're seeing more in disaster, and there's groups doing it, there's platforms for it. And that can sometimes be something that takes the pressure off governments. If you're trying to play hot potato, something to look into. And that's just a little picture about that. And I believe that is my final thing, because I saw Peter's face, so it means I'm done.
Leila, wow, that was fantastic. I too love your audacity is your capacity. I think that's a really wonderful thought, and something certainly to carry away from this. But there was much that you said that was really, really worthy. I thought about both Denyse and you talking about timing and communications and organization, and all those things are so key to us being better with donations management. We have a long way to go, I think, in many ways. We have a couple of questions here, folks. We have about 8 minutes or a little less than that, because I'll be signing off and telling you about our next webinar session coming up. So Dylan asks, do you think BC would benefit from the generation and support of SVOAD, like organizations or VALS? It seems like many of your comments pertain to NGO engagement. Leila, I think that's really directed at you.
Yeah. Yes. And so what I'll say is BC does have, like, we have a provincial nonprofit recovery coordination committee that we do work with, and is incredible to work with. And so I think that's something that we're doing. I know there's some people who are on that committee who are on this call, which is great, but can we work deeper and tighter on donations? And I think, and is that something that's also available to local governments, right? I think local governments can do things like unmet needs committees and things like that. But I know that the VOAD idea, that's voluntary organizations active in disaster, that's an American term, that saved my life when it came to donations work and disaster response and recovery in the States. So I can't love that enough.
Great. Question, I think, Denyse, you could probably handle this. What about donor fatigue? Can we go back to supporters too often is the question.
I think that you can. There are some big companies that get hit every single time. I know, like with all of the silent auction requests or things like that. And so, yes, we can. But that's where I mentioned supporting local businesses as well. Don't just hit up the big guys, the little guys. That helps to keep them in business, and it keeps the community going after they come back.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Thank you. Now, Charmaine, you have actually a story to tell here, and rather than me recite it, do you want to come off mute and actually relate that story? Because I think it's powerful, and I think it's something that should be shared here.
For being a bit of a storyteller, sorry for the entire context story.
Love a story.
Back in 2013, there was a significant fire that affected a multifamily complex in Burnaby. And within 6 hours, the structure was full structural collapse. So from between midnight and 6 a.m., the residents on the sidewalk watched their life burn up in smoke. And these were all pet parents as well, every resident except for one. What happened was that a morning show picked up on the news reports that had been happening on Monday afternoon and Monday, and they started having a conversation about the incident. And one of the hosts said, well, I can donate, insert object here, which started a flood of phone calls and an ad hoc donations campaign with callers phoning in with what they had and so on. I happened to be listening to that particular radio broadcast on my way into work and was slowly losing my mind on the drive in. But we were able to coordinate with the Salvation Army, kudos to you, who opened up their Burnaby Citadel location as a resiliency center and a site where we could potentially direct well-intended donations. And that site, from when we opened it at noon, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it was completely overwhelmed, floor to ceiling, full of stuff, good stuff, crappy stuff, just stuff. And just to organize it would be way too much. And what we wound up trying to communicate through social channels and our website was, please don't donate goods. What these people need is a permanent place to live. They need a forever home. And that really got missed during this radio broadcast. But people that had phoned in and committing goods then got very angry that no one was coming to pick up their stuff.
Yep.
And we don't need a 12-chair expandable dining room table for an individual that lives in an apartment, but doesn't have anywhere to go. So what we have made many attempts to do is to create a donations management framework. But where we need the help is, we're all about stealing everybody else's great ideas. And so I'm looking my eye to the province to say, what is the framework and who is on the Integrated Disaster Council of BC that has made a commitment to donations management? Are there faith-based organizations and secular organizations provincially, nationally, that Emergency Management BC has liaised with that we can be informed to have as that point of, let's start that conversation with those faith-based organizations. Because frankly, I don't have the staff. You're looking at my entire department, and I don't have the staff to go out to 55 different faith-based organization entities that are housed in Burnaby and ask them to cooperate in donations management. So I'm kind of turning the tables on the province to say, help us, help these people. Because our fire was not considered by the province to be an entity or an incident for which the province could help out. It's local, it's up to you. And, you know, you can see, you know, tears welling in the eyes, and ESS is completely overwhelmed. And all we're trying to focus on is getting these people out of a hotel and into a temporary home, and soon to be a forever home that will accept animals. And therein lies the problem. So EMBC, help me. Who's on IDCBC that can help me? Thanks very much for listening to my tale.
Wow, great story, Charmaine. Thank you for sharing that. And in a way, and I'd love you two to respond, but we're down to we have 2 minutes literally left. So if you wanted just one quick thought from each of you on what Charmaine said. Denyse, why don't you start?
So one of the things that I hope to share was, as a community, what we've done in my community is I actually organized through our recreation center an event that has become an annual event where people hold a giant garage sale to sell the things like that 12-seat table and any other items. And so the cost of their 10 by 10 area for their garage sale items, plus a certain percentage of their sales, goes to a cash donation to whatever the cause is for that year. So it's something really practical that communities can do ongoing to help people get rid of the junk in their garage, have it not be stored anywhere, but still be able to help a cause.
Awesome, thank you. Leila.
I would say, I mean, again, I've been in those shoes for Charmaine. And that's why, again, that pre-messaging and that ruthlessness of being like, you don't want someone else to say people need things and then have to deal with the after effect. I don't coordinate IDCBC. I know there are groups on that council that are amazing when it comes to donations. I think one of them I'll shout out is ADRA, the Adventists, because they did some donations kind of organizing and kind of collection post-Lytton. So they might have some things to share if you're looking for advice on kind of donations management and things like that. And there's other, organizations that also do that, like in terms of, food banks and other groups that are incredible when it comes to donations management. But I sent you my email, Charmaine, if we can just chat over email if you want some tighter information and more ideas. I know we're short on time.
Yes, we are. It's 4 o'clock, and I want to thank you both. That was really, really amazing. And I thank you for what you're doing in the communities that you are impacting on. And I wish the world had many more of both of you. It was just awesome. So thanks to you folks who were able to attend. Spread the word. Next one is on February the 16th, and it is on food security. This is an amazing project. Keep it alive by sharing the links, and we'll hope to see you then. But thank you so much, Denyse and Leila. Awesome.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.